The man leading that investigation is the chairman of the Oversight Committee, Chairman James Comer, who joins me right now, along with Peter Schweizer, who is probing the consequences in his role as president of the Government Accountability Institute. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us this morning. Congressman Comer, thanks for your leadership. What can you tell us about your investigation?
Well, we've identified the 4 staffers that we believe were the ones who actually took the documents and placed them in the auto pen, pressed power, and had Joe Biden's signature magically appear on these. We want to know who gave them the authority to do that, and we want them to walk us through the exact process of how major items of huge legal consequences like pardons and executive orders ended up being placed in the auto pen and having Joe Biden's signature forged on there. We also are bringing in Dr. O'Connor. Dr. O'Connor was a physician. Ronnie Jackson did a great job talking about the holes in his analysis that he made public versus the reality of the health situation that Joe Biden was really in. And if you'll remember, Maria, back during the Biden influence peddling investigation, Dr. O'Connor's name came up in one of the schemes with Jim Biden with AmeriCorps Health, and that was a scheme that Jim Biden and Joe Biden were involved in. That was one of the schemes where we identified Joe Biden actually received $200,000 in an influence peddling scheme. So we believe that Dr. O'Connor, as Ronnie Jackson said, was very involved with the Biden family. We believe that there was, the possibility that he would, maybe sign something that wasn't true and make public with respect to the president's health. So we have a lot of questions, and I can say today that their attorneys, when we sent the letters, you have to give them a few days to lawyer up. All 5 of the people we sent letters to have hired attorneys. We're communicating with their attorneys, and I hope that at the beginning of next week, we'll announce dates where they'll be coming in for transcribed interviews.
At the beginning of next week. Peter Schweizer, what is your reaction to all of this? And give us a sense of what you've learned.
Well, I think the House Oversight Committee is doing terrific work, as they did on the Hunter Biden case. And I think this is essential because what we're talking about here is essentially the capture of the Oval Office, potentially by people that were not elected, who are really running things. My concern is the question of the quality of the testimony they're going to get. Congressman Comer, a few months ago, sent to Attorney General Pam Bondi a very detailed list in letter form of all the examples of the Biden family lying under oath before Congress. And the point is, if you can get away with lying before Congress, they're going to continue to lie. So my question is, Congressman Comer, has there been any movement at all by DOJ on any of those instances of people lying before your committee?
Congressman?
Not yet, but we're hopeful. Not yet, but we're hopeful, and we're obviously pushing the Department of Justice. As you both know, all Congress can do is investigate. When it comes to holding people accountable, then that's going to have to be the Department of Justice. Our criminal referrals to the Department of Justice had a 5-year statute of limitations, so they're good throughout the entire Trump administration. We're hopeful that Pam Bondi will set an example out of people who have lied before Congress, like Jim Biden and like Hunter Biden.
Yeah, but, I mean, we need more than hope, Congressman, okay? I mean, we've been here before. Russia collusion, Hunter Biden laptop, over and over again. Is it not a felony to lie in front of Congress?
Absolutely. And we issued criminal referrals. Hunter Biden committed perjury. Jim Biden lied in front of Congress. And there are others in other investigations who have lied, and there's been no accountability. So we're certainly going to continue to investigate, but we're desperately seeking accountability from the Department of Justice, and hopefully that'll happen. Because when you talk about using the auto pen to sign these executive orders were many meant to Trump-proof this White House. And if we can find information that would lead us to believe that Joe Biden had no knowledge of those executive orders being signed in his name, then I think that the Trump administration could get them thrown out in court, and then Trump would be able to execute his agenda a whole lot easier without all the Trump-proofing that happened with the auto pen at the end of the Biden administration.
Well, I mean, it's just extraordinary to me. Look at how all of these policies have affected the American people. 13 service members are dead because of the botched exit from Afghanistan. People were going broke because we had 40-year high inflation. I mean, boys and girls sports. The list is long, Peter. Are we ever going to see accountability in your view?
Well, I hope we do, and I think these investigations by House Oversight are a key start to that. But at the end of the day, you have to have the teeth that when laws were violated, that people will actually be prosecuted. That's the key element. Look, we have to look at the magnitude of what's going on here. We are talking about subverting the authority of the President of the United States. What the Democrats have done reminds me of a story about a major in Vietnam who had gone in and wiped out a village, burned 5,000 homes, and he was asked why he did it, and he said, "We had to destroy the village in order to save it." That's essentially what the Democrats have done, driven by this fear of Trump and Trump's agenda. They have literally damaged the American presidency. And if you want to talk about the lack of trust in our institutions, this is precisely the sort of thing that has been done. So this is not about looking at the past. This is not regurgitating the past. This is about the integrity of the office of the presidency. And we need to have an absolute thorough vetting of what was done. And by the way, it's not just about the auto pen. There are lots of people in America who have parents of diminished means who there's questions about when they're signing documents and signing wills. Did they really know what they were signing?
Yeah,
we have to have a clear understanding that Joe Biden knew.
Mr. Chairman, how rich that all these years the Democrats have been telling us that Donald Trump is a threat to democracy while they were actually threatening democracy.
That's all they've done. They don't have an ideology. Our good friend Stephen Miller said it well in an interview a couple of days ago. There is no ideology. There is no vision by the Democrat Party. They just want to obstruct. They want to create fear in the voters that the Republicans are somehow a threat to democracy, when all the evidence shows that everything they've done over the last 4.5 years has been a threat to democracy. And one more thing, Maria, I said next week. This is Sunday, so we're talking about in a couple of days. In a matter of days, hours, we should be able to hopefully announce something about these 5 individuals coming in.
Well, we're going to keep on it, and I'm going to come back to you in a couple of days. If I don't see it, we're counting on you, we're counting on Ed Martin, and we're counting on Pam Bondi. Thank you, gentlemen. House Oversight Committee Chairman Congressman James Comer and the President of Government Accountability Institute, Peter Schweizer. We'll be right back.
Hi, everyone. I'm Brian Kilmeade. I want you to do me a favor. I want you to click to subscribe to the Fox News YouTube page. This is the only way that I know for sure that you're not going to miss any great commentary, any great news bites, any great interviews coming your way on Fox. You can get it all here on YouTube. So subscribe right now.